Welcome to Leith Live series of podcasts. In this podcast, Miles is talking to Archibald Minto, or Archie as he's called, who is accompanied by his cousin Rose. Archie tells us what it was like growing up with right side hemiplegia, a form of cerebral palsy, in 1950s Leith. At a time when disabled children were often taken from their families and placed in special homes, Archie's mother and father fought to keep him at home and to be educated in mainstream school. The dedicated teachers who taught him, including a Sister Columba, shaped Archie's young life. Whilst at home, his father worked hard to buy a home for his family, and his mother fought for everything she could get to help Archie. It is due to their strong characters and extended maternal family that he is the man he is today.
My full name is Archibald Minto. There is no middle name, and that might be because of my grandfather's parenting. I was born on the 2nd of November 1949, and I'm not actually sure, it might have been Simpsons, but I'd have to check that on the birth certificate. As it turns out, my birth was problematic for my mum. It was a long labour, and the technical words for it is I had anoxia because of a cord around my neck, and it was a forceps delivery, which resulted in right side hemiplegia. And I say hemiplegia because that's significant as time passes. Yeah. So it's cerebral palsy. It's a form of cerebral palsy. So that was 1949. My mum started noticing there was something wrong because I lay very still as a baby. Not that I wasn't glacial or anything like that. It was just I was very still. And the other signal to her was that the nurses on the postnatal service always looked at me with great interest. And she got one of the nurses to tell her what had happened because the doctors had not. And when she discovered that, she went to, I think it was Dr. Butler was a GP. I wouldn't have been wanted to be in the room with her for that conversation. It became apparent then that I was a candidate for the Westerly or the spastic system of Gaudet. I got assessment after assessment, and my mum did an awful lot of the work because my dad was a docker and he had to work. But his contribution was to say, we were living in Coatfield Lane, part of Catholics, part of St Mary's Leith Parish, sort of people who got there last because we're so close. Anyway, my dad said, we cannot live here, damp. So what he did was he was the first and only member of his generation to buy a property, which turned out to be initially number 46 Balfour Place. And the family were in Balfour Place for quite a long time. We moved, we were in, it was 46 Balfour Street, but we moved to 31 to a better house and then finally to Balfour Place. So my mum is engaged and does engage the social services of the time. They looked at my brain, they looked at my body, and the ultimate meeting, or the penultimate meeting at Westerly, my mother was told by a lady that if they held on to me, I would become criminal. Yeah, seriously. And I understand why as years passed. Because I was a product of two very intense people. That was basically it. Intense in entirely different ways. My mum probably could have been an academic. My father was a working man, but when he said something was going to happen, by God, it happened. So my mother was at the penultimate meeting and the woman was giving her all threats of hell mend you type of thing. And my mum, I think, this is only my speculation, had actually decided that they would hand me over. But her husband wasn't there and he had to be there. So she said, okay, a second meeting, and I don't know the dates of this, but it must be at least 54 because it's just before primary school. They both attend. And again, this is my speculation, but they were on the point of handing me over. But my dad or my mum asked the critical question, can we visit? And the answer was no, because most families at that time were just dumping their disabled kids.
Right.
Those 5, so up until you were 5, and these decisions were being made about you, as you say, prior to school. What are your memories of, because I remember your mum saying that she spent a lot of time making you exercise and physio.
Yes, that tended to be a bit later.
When did you start getting operations up in the PMR?
Oh, this is later. My first operation was in 1959.
Right.
58, 59. It was my 9th birthday I was in hospital. So that's a wee bit later in the scheme of things. But the primary the primary actor that appeared on the scene was Sister Columba. We were Catholics. Once my mother realised, they realised that they weren't going to hand me over, they had to do something with me. And because they were Catholic, they went to the local Catholic school, St Mary's in Leith, Yardheads. The headmistress did not receive my mother with any great joy. I think that's one way of putting it, because she basically ducked the decision. But Sister Columba had arrived as a new teacher, Irish lady, Holy Family Order. I was in touch with Sister Columba my entire life, and 2 years before her death I met her. I visited 3 times. The third time she didn't recognise me. So the staff said we're very grateful. But the last time I visited her, she was confusing. She was running stories of different pupils. I triggered her memory of the day. So Sister Columba is presented with my mother and me. I don't know the physical arrangements, but my mother certainly spoke to her and told her what had happened. Sister Columba and I met, and we clicked. Just simply that. We looked into each other's eyes and said, "You are a friend." She said to my mother, "Leave him with me for a year. Do not come back to the school. Do not plough the play park."
Yeah.
It was all, not a park, it was bloody concrete or tarmac, but you know the idea.
Yeah, yeah.
So young Archie is Jimmy No Mates. He can't run, he can't handle a ball, but he is extremely observant because of these. So Archie gets the breaks, goes into the playground, got interested in girls. Why do girls go to different toilets? Strange things. It's a brain. Why do the girls go in different... Well, it was the girls and... Anyway.
Yeah.
And then somebody would come up and scalp him and run away. This happened quite a few times. So Archie said, "I'm going to stop this." So what he did was the next time someone did it, he waited. I don't know if he smiled, but he probably was smiling inside because he'd got a revenge plan. So very, very carefully, over weeks, he sidled up to the perpetrator and he kicked the hell out of him as far as a 5-year-old disabled child could. This happened 3 times to Archie's memory. And Sister Columba said, "Archie," or words to this effect, "Archie, this is not a good strategy." And Sister Columba was not God, but God's second in command. So Archie listened. But the situation resolved itself, and I'm not sure about dates for this. But one day, a parent comes into the school saying, "That's a wee thug, get rid of him." Why? "He spat on my son." Sister Columba says to the mother, "Did you ask your wee Jimmy," it was James, "what he was doing while Archie was launching a missile attack?" "No." "Well, go and do so." She came back shamefaced. Her son was holding my left hand down with his two hands on the desk. The mother was shamefaced. And all that turned the corner of my acceptability. The other thing which was fairly apparent was that I was not going to be a docker. At this time the docks were very good. My dad was working his tail off, and he subsequently possibly died of an industrial injury very young, but he was working his tail off, and he was improving our housing conditions dramatically. First from the near, I think it was a top floor flat in 46 Balfour Street, we moved to 31, which was upmarket because it was a different, it wasn't the same tenement, it was above the dairy, that type of thing.
All right.
So we were moving on. And ultimately, by certainly, I'm not entirely sure of the dates, but by the early 60s, we were in Balfour Place, which was reckoned to be slightly better, probably more accommodation, because by that time we'd have three children. My brother arrived in 1954, and much to my mother's surprise, she told me, my sister arrived in 1961. My mother was 41 at that age, which is something at the time.
Yeah.
Family legend, whether we ever said it or not, family legend was that my sister was privileged. She got driven to her christening. My brother and I had to walk. You can see the thing. The realisation Archie wasn't going to be a docker. And this I cannot explain, probably because Sister Columba or the school was working with my parents. But I do recall that for part of my primary, I was 16th in a class of 32 when it came to exams. Somehow or other, by the time I went to Holy Cross Academy in 1962, so by the time I was about 12, I was one of 6 who passed the 11 plus and got to the senior Catholic secondary. There was a Mr. Davis as a teacher, I remember. Sister Columba and Mr. Davis are the two teachers. I knew the others. There was Sister Columba, Mother Agnes. My sister and my brother got on with the nuns. My sister did not. And she, for her, Mother Agnes, I think, was a dragon. I can believe why. Sister Cecilia is in our memory because she was incredibly pretty. So secondary school came. I was put in 1D. This is Holy Cross Academy on Ferry Road with its houses, with its grammar school, headed by Mr. Toner. His daughter was in my class, actually. Went to Holy Cross, 1D, in other words, the ones who had just scraped in. By second year, I was in 2B, but I never got to 2A. This was my ever, which is fair enough. Mr. Toner, I think, liked me. I think he did like me. One of the things that they could not do to me was to give me the belt. And that upset more than one teacher. But one of them was definitely trying to get me.
Right.
And it's really, I can't remember which actual years, but I was happy there. The one thing I do remember about 1D is there was a guy who I think his name was Entwistle. He was as thick as 2 short planks, but he could do arithmetic at 98% accuracy.
That's impressive.
And you can imagine, is he now a bookie who's very rich? I've got no idea, but you get the idea. Always observant, always not quite on guard, but ready to defend.
So you spoke about having to kind of fight for your corner in primary school. What was it like when you went to the bigger school?
Well, they were a bit more civilised. Remember, this is a senior secondary with green uniforms. Right. Sancta Crux es spes nostra. Our rivals were not in the school. There was a black bunch down at Trinity Academy.
Right. Wow.
Oh, yes. 60s gang warfare. In uniform. Quite funny. The teachers I remember was Mr. Dowds, because I was interested in history. I always wanted to understand how things were, because from there on you can figure out what you want to do to respond to it. This is, again, I don't know how much this is my mother and how much it's my disability. You can't really separate these things. I've always been interested in history. How the hell did they get into that position in the first place? Because a lot of people said that to me for various reasons. I should be dead at least 5 times.
Right.
But there's a story about why I'm still sitting here. Mr. Dowds, Miss Murdoch, maths teacher, she became the head teacher of St. Augustine's ultimately. She must have been, she's probably 10 years older than me at the time.
Right.
So she was young.
Yeah.
There was a young coterie of teachers. We had an American guy who came across for a year, called us the Bay City Rollers. We didn't figure it out until we realised he came from San Francisco, and Edinburgh is a bay city.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite fascinating.
Never thought of that before, actually.
Yeah.
That's interesting, isn't it?
That's why he called us. I think the Bay City Rollers were.
Yeah.
But he was an alive personality.
Yeah.
The school was Catholic. One of my classmates, or a number of my classmates, were Polish.
Right.
Because these were second generation children of people who never went back to Poland after the war. Danuta Maszewska, I discovered, but your daddy's Maszewski. She said, yeah, it's our language. Richard Haluka, a very active mind, set fire to methylated spirits in the physics lab. A wall of flame. Richard Haluka sent the sound generator just below hearing and made the class antsy.
Wow.
Richard Haluka became a priest. And when, in the 5th year, when he was telling us about this, I said, I don't believe this. He said, well, I'll invite you to my ordination and you can laugh in my face then. And he did. He became, well, he's still, as far as I know, it's a few years since I met him, but he wasn't well the last time I saw him. But he became a scholar of Isaiah, a very significant academic, Father Richard Haluka, or Rizyard Haluka.
Oh.
Other teachers, well, Miss Williamson. Miss Williamson taught me not to be visible.
Right.
I couldn't do the gym, so I was at a loose end. I can't remember what, probably 2nd year. I was in full uniform and I was getting bored, so I started walking around the playground. And that triggered the action of one of the teachers. She hadn't really thought about me. Some of them did, but a lot of them didn't. But I thought, okay, that taught me to take a book in and just bloody well read it, while the rest of them are slogging their guts. I didn't want to join. I didn't see any point in it at all. The exercises that my mum was doing was done from me being 9 until, well, by 18 it was much improved.
Right.
One of the things about the exercises, it wasn't my legs she exercised as much as my arm.
Right.
What happened was that I was under the direction of Mr. Pollock. They called themselves Mr., the surgeons. And Mr. Pollock did remarkable work. But one day, Mr. Pollock, off the top of his head, said, that arm is in his road, cut it off. My mother, ooh! But my mother's sitting, after hearing this, somewhere in the hospital. I'm being examined and twisted. Not a happy experience. Although, when I was in the hospital as a 9-year-old, there was 2 beautiful night nurses, one in dark hair, one in blondes, and they were beautiful. My first crush on 2 girls at the same time. That was my hospital. This was slightly before this operation to my leg, which was successful. So Mr. Pollock just casually said that. My mother's in tears. She's sitting somewhere and she mentions a little green man. It's in her, that's what she saw him.
Yeah.
There was a bunch, I think, of physios, and I think Israeli. I don't know, there's something that's...
Yeah.
But one of them saw my mum in tears. He came across and he said, what's wrong? And she told him. And he simply said, are you prepared to do some exercises? She said, yes. So what he did was he showed her how to straighten my arm.
Wow.
So it became less a parent.
Right.
The cerebral palsy has funny effects. I can carry a very heavy weight. It's the way the muscle system develops. I can walk for miles with weight because I'm basically strong.
Yeah.
That was the other issue. I am very strong. It's just where it's used.
Yeah.
So Mum's in tears. The wee green man comes up, gives her the exercises, she carries him out, and at the next interview with Mr. Pollock, apparently he just said, my mother, I can imagine this. She probably got out of the chair and went to grab him by the neck. Mr. Pollock's sidekick was a Mr. Shepherd. Mr. Shepherd intervened and said, Mrs. Minto, just could I speak to you in a minute? She said, I'll kill him. Horrible death as possible. I can see it in her mind. But she was a rational woman. Mr. Shepherd said, I know that he's a bit focused or something like that. I can see how the conversation would go. But you are extremely privileged. He only ever sees you all the time. And something else that I haven't been able to trace yet, once the leg operation was done, there was a medical photograph taken of me and a girl the same age whose parents had not exercised her. And this is in some I don't know what year, medical journal.
Right.
And I always felt that was cruel.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But we're talking about the 1950s.
Yeah, yeah.
Holy Cross Academy. Now. I became a prefect. Power. I did suggest a headmaster that would be issued with machine guns.
That sounds like If, the film.
Just to get, this business of going in line. Because remember, I leave the school in 1968, so there's all things are changing.
Yeah.
All things are changing. The teacher, I think his name might have been Lupin, who didn't like the fact he couldn't belt me, got an opportunity because I was in a dinner queue and somebody was bugging me. And this bugging had been going on for some time. So I had a satchel, I whipped out a ruler and I started to saw his ear.
As you do.
As you do. Well, I had to use the tools that was available to me. And the thing is, people don't expect a left hand to attack them. They're right focused. So this guy got a shock. This teacher pulled me out the line. He couldn't belt me, so he sent me to Mr. Toner. And Mr. Toner said, why did you try to saw his ear off, Archie? I said, he did that. Oh, he said. So both with Sister Columba and with the secondary school, people began to think second before going at me.
Right.
And I've always used that technique. I know people will have a go, but they'll only do it once. In one instance, I had a job, I'm quite strong, so at 13 I had a paper round.
Right.
And I would actually go down Leith Walk and get the papers. I think it was Manderson Street. I could carry Mr. Bertram's papers to Balfour Street quite well.
Right.
And consistently. And two young men, well, we'd all be 13, I suppose, round about the Alhambra, or the location of the Alhambra cinema on Leith Walk, I realised I'd seen them 3 times, just about the time I was walking up with the papers. And I knew they had some intent, because this day they started circling me, and they started closing in the circle. And I said, these guys are going to try and trip me up. So I watched, and when they came to the final run in, I braced myself, I lifted my left leg, I put all my weight onto the guider and broke it in 2 and walked over them and didn't look back. The thing is impression. I don't look back. I just say, try that, and you will take the consequences.
Mm.
Now that's basically my father.
Right.
It's not my mother's.
Right.
That's my father's lizard brain, but that lizard brain is connected to a reasonably powerful, but not the same as my mother's brain.
Mm.
My brother, Bill, has a PhD in high energy physics and lives in America. My sister, Liz, well, what can I say about Liz? Other than that, I gave her away at her wedding day because her father was already passed away. But a half generation makes a difference. That's why Rose is more of she's a sister and not a cousin, because of how the families.
Well, I was going to, at this point, actually, ask you about, we've talked about school, but how it was in the home, but you've just mentioned, being a paper boy.
Yeah.
But I was going to say to you, Rose, what are your perceptions of when Archie was growing up and visiting the house? And
Well, what I remember most was getting slapped by my mum because he used to wear a caliper. I don't know if you know what a caliper is, but it's a metal frame that goes round up to the knee. And he would take it off when they came to visit. And I went and put it on one day. My mum was not happy. Mocking is catching. But I do remember going to visit him in PMR. We weren't allowed in because we were children, but I'd stand outside the ward waving.
right. Right.
And we'd walk all the way up to the PMR from Ops Gangs. Right up there.
So this is the Princess
Margaret Rose. It was a
Road.
famous. They were really good at orthopaedics. It was an orthopaedic hospital.
Mm.
Yeah.
And further to the school, getting into the school, what I remember is the people at Westerlee, or the matron, had said to your mum and dad, "You'll not get in an ordinary school," because at that time they didn't accept people with disability.
Yeah.
And they said, "No, he'll not get in. You go and see if you can get someone to take him in."
And you, the exercises that you were doing from the age of 9, how often in the day were these? And how long did it go on for? Or?
Morning and night. And he used to scream with pain.
Right.
Because it was painful. The only person prepared to do them was my mother. My dad wouldn't do them.
Right.
My favourite auntie was Maisie, who was the wife of my mother's brother. She wouldn't do them. And the Minto family have put themselves towards the pale by saying on my birth, "We've never had a cripple in our family." That didn't impress my daddy at all.
No.
So the other thing was that my Minto cousins were older, because my father was a baby of the family. His eldest brother was born in, I think, 1911, my namesake. He was born in 1928.
Oh, right.
Oh, yes. Yes. So one or two of my cousins on the Minto side I got to know. Of them, my memories are that Rachel probably was the auntie who gave the expression of my cripplehood. My father, being the baby of the family, was always treated as the baby of the family until one Christmas. My mother would prepare a Christmas meal, and we because our house was better than theirs. Fascinating. Anyway, because the rest of them were living nice, but local authority houses, Loch End, that type of thing. Yeah. They said, and my dad heard it, "I wouldn't have this mess here." What? All Christmas dinners stopped, and then we went to hotels, and they bloody well paid. Families.
Yeah.
Families. My cousin Robert, who was the son of my father's sister Mary, there's Rachel, Mary. I think there was babies who looked at the gravestones. I've seen children who didn't survive, one who died quite young. Right. You can get all that sort of thing if you look at the gravestones. There was also Elizabeth. Elizabeth married a man called Halcrow, and they went off to South Africa. he was a mill, I think it was the mills, the flour mills.
Aye.
I only met my cousins once, and that was enough, because they were rampant apartheidists in the 70s. We did not get on. That visit was never repeated. Very amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
McIntyres were entirely, or the McAteers, because you have to look at how the McIntyres became McIntyres before they got mixed up with the Wheatleys.
Mixed up with them.
Well, or the Wheatleys got mixed up with the McIntyres,
Wow,
whichever way
yeah.
you look at it. It's absolutely fascinating. So the Christmas dinner caused my Minto side to disengage, I think. And the last and really sad little episode was Rachel's son Mary was my namesake, Archibald Robertson. And he, I think, was a police officer for some time, and one of his stories was, or a special, he really left the profession because he couldn't handle car crashes. And he made a successful career for himself, I think, in insurance. I'd have to check that. But he became very affluent, and he had a house, I think, in Mayfield Road. And my dad wanted to see this, but it took Archie an incredible time to invite. And by the time he did make the invitation, it was not accepted. But my dad could see who folk that he would not trust, because trust was an incredible thing for him.
Right.
Just three things about my dad. One was that he went to one management course. He was a docker, but occasionally he was a checker, so he got to write the papers. He would spend nights making sure those papers were right. That was, this is me. This is an element in me. He would also take charge of the money that his colleagues wanted to go to their wives before they went to the pub. I don't know if we call it a credit union, because he gave them money, but they trusted him.
Yeah.
They didn't like him, though, because he would not allow them to break cargo. An accidental bottle of crate of beer.
Which is common.
He was offered the chance to be a meter, but being a Catholic, he didn't like what it meant.
Right.
Didn't do it. So my mother was convinced he would end up in the dock because he was offending people, which I do. You just breathe and you offend some people. But the most wonderful thing is I was not at his funeral. By this time, his death in 1980, I was in Abu Dhabi as a civil engineer, building very large diameter pipes. I phoned home and there was a chance for me to return, but that was his last good day, and he answered the phone.
Right.
Now, I didn't know he was ill because he was listening to all my phone calls and reading all the letters that my mother got from me, and he did not know how ill he was.
Right.
His employer did very well by him, by the standard, but this is 1980 when containerisation had arrived in 65 and it gradually, but he was such a good worker that his employer pushed the boat out as far as they could in the time. It still didn't give my mother a good pension, but that's another story. But what my mother tells me is that on his funeral day in Mount Vernon, she was in the second car behind the hearse, as you would have. And she saw the party in front of us. Must have been a busy day. There were an awful lot of people in it. One of them turned and saw her. This is only hearsay from me. My brother would probably have it better. Or were you there?
I'd be there, yeah.
Well, you can confirm if this is what I was told, was that somebody saw my mother and realised they were following the wrong car. So about 200 men about turned
Oh my
and
goodness.
lined up at the back. Now, what do you remember of it?
Yeah, I remember your mum being pleasantly surprised at how many
Wow.
had turned out for her.
God, that's some accolade, isn't
It
it?
is. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
So there's my dad getting basically a very large group of men all to turn up for him, although in their heart of hearts they didn't like him.
But respect, I suppose.
The respect was very, very strong.
Yeah.
The other connection with the dock is that I graduated as a civil engineer, and my first summer job was in Leith docks.
Right.
In the engineering department, as it happens. And I've been on the dock, surprisingly cold if you're in a boat on the dock, even though it's a blazing day.
Yeah.
But I was part of the engineering department. One of the jobs I had was to keep the fuel logs of the tugs, the Oxcar. That was a fascinating thing because one of the staff members, I can't remember his name, but he gave me stories of the shore at Leith with minesweepers.
Wow.
Remember, the bridge is more recent. And he would tell me about, I think he must have been a naval officer as a very young man. But my Uncle Willie, my mother's senior brother, had a shed. Now, I don't know how it worked, but I think because he was a war pensioner, getting his leg shot off at Tobruk, he was given that work because he could do it.
Yeah.
So he had a shed and he got produce from Holland and he got chances of holidays, got chances of property.
Yeah.
But he wouldn't take it, not that generation.
No.
Two things that he and I were fanatical about was vehicles.
Right.
As a very young child, he tells me, well, he's passed away now, but he tells me that he must have had one of the very early invalid carriages, tricycle, and what he would do, would he have me on his lap, and my fingers saw this big red button. You can imagine, this is a dead switch for the engine. So he'd be motoring along and
Sudden stop.
time passed. He was given a AC blue tricycle. Bloody dangerous things. But he let me drive it in the dock. Until one day we learned a wee bit more about its mechanism that I hadn't realised. It was a dead man's lever. You had to be sure of what gear you were in before you switched it on. And he had parked it not too far away from the dock edge. And I started the motor and the thing went backwards. We said nothing, but he took the keys and never gave them back. He eventually got a Mini, and I don't know, I must have been underage for driving, that's for sure, 16, but I was big. He had the hand controls because what made us friends was I was the only child that was not afraid of his tin leg.
Oh, right.
His left leg had gone, my right leg had gone, and we just said to each other, well, we've got two legs between us. So it was that sort of thing. His Mini came along and he had a hand clutch, but the clutch was still there.
Right.
So I got to drive the Mini. And the most interesting experience in the Mini was he would let me drive some of the distance to Port Seaton.
Right.
And I was good. Very good, actually. Because we were going through Preston Pans. And you know it's narrow.
Yeah.
There was a bloody great big truck coming the other way at speed. And this was one of the life or death moments. For some reason, I was able to mount the pavement, get the Mini's wheels running along the building line and getting past that truck. He said, "Keep going." And I kept going, and we stopped in Port Seaton car park. He said, "Open the window." I opened the window. He opened his window, and we went, "Ah!" for a long time.
I'm not surprised. A close call.
Yes. And a similar, I can think of four. Well, the first one wasn't too bad. There was a parachute practice thing in Leith Links. And I, with my leg iron, I didn't call it a caliper, it was a leg iron.
Yeah.
Cost my mother an awful lot of money because it needed special boots that one of the schools had. And it was a very simple frame which hinked into the heel. but the very mechanism tore shoes. So it was an expensive. That's probably why Rose's mother was really not happy about it, because these shoes were very, very important.
Right.
And it's things you don't think about until later. Anyway, I climbed a tower. Sergeant instructor at the top looked at me. And it was the first time I heard the word insurance, I think. He said, "You can't go off on the whatever it is, the harness." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Insurance." I said, "But I'm actually safer than any of these punters you put over the side." He said, "Yes, but it's insurance." And that's when I first realised that hemiplegia particularly causes insurance companies hives, because they can't predict.
Right.
Even today, I was saying to Rose in the car as I came here, I cannot take a second walking stick. Now, it sounds not a problem, but in reality it is, because if you had my condition, or leg, you broke your leg or whatever, you would have 3 points of contact. You'd have 2 crutches and a foot.
Yeah.
I can't use a second crutch or walking stick. So I am a mechanism.
Right.
Because you don't have the tripod is a stable thing.
Yeah.
A two-legged thing is not stable.
Right.
It's interesting. I only realised this recently.
That's a very engineer's explanation of that.
Yes,
I have
but
to say.
I'm an engineer.
Well,
and
indeed.
I thought it through, because what I have to do is to convince people that they're not taking their lives in their hands by allowing me to do things. And I've been able to do that reasonably successfully.
Well, let's take you back, and I'll ask you one more. You talked about kind of getting your position at school.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like in the community where you were living? You are seen as a disabled young person. How did you fight your corner there?
Well, because of the operation, I got less and less visible.
Right.
Because my arm could never completely straighten. I did not realise I was disabled, because I was doing everything. The sports was a different matter, but I did dance after a fashion. So I became less and less visible. One of the marks of that is slightly later. I did say I worked in the Middle East. I got a medical before going, and I got medical a couple of years later, and the doctor, I guess it's in the 70s, the doctor said, "Are you Archie Minto?" I said, "Yes, I'm Archie Minto." He said, "But there's no sign of your cerebral palsy in the notes." I said, "Well, that's your colleague's problem, not mine." So it was through the secondary years, the disability was not apparent. And that's where people come unstuck, when they thought wrongly of how I was going to react to things. And I realised that there was a berserker element in me. The psychologists at the early days were right. If I had ended up in St Jude's Laundry, I would have been very, very dangerous. Strong.
I'll ask one last thing to you, Rose. So what was, Archie, you said that your father's side of the family, somebody said a cripple in the family. How was Archie perceived from your side and your mother?
He was just Archie, my cousin.
Right. So there was no.
No. And Auntie Rose used to come out every week. Like, the relationship was there. And I actually stayed, because they were close sisters.
Right, yeah.
And Uncle Willie was their brother. So they were close.
Yeah.
Because they had lost their mum when she was only 40.
So
Archie was Archie.
For better or worse.
Shall we leave it at
There
that
was
point?
No thoughts of disability or...
No, he just was.
Acceptance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where the McIntyres did,
Yeah.
the Mintos did not, which is interesting.
Well, that's a good place to end, on acceptance, you see.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this podcast with Archie. You can find more like it on our website, www.livingmemory.org.uk, Or, if you have a story you'd like to share, why not pop in and see us at the Wee Museum of Memory Ocean Terminal, Leith, or at the Centre Livingston. Alternatively, you could give us a call on 07714 783 726. Until the next time, take care.